Hey everyone. Hey Nick, how's it going?
Very well. How are you? You okay?
Good. Thanks for joining in what I can only assume is your evening. What is it, 6 o'clock for you in the UK?
Exactly that. Yeah. Literally on the money. So we're getting there. An absolute miserable day at that. So much as the world.
Yeah, look at this guy. It is end of quarter, end of month, end of day, and he's joining to come talk about RevOps with us today. So really appreciate it. We've got a lot of people in the session. Just housekeeping. Please post questions in the chat on the screen. Drop them into the LinkedIn, and we'll get them brought over. These conversations, I feel like, are always so much better when we have audience interaction and participation. But as we kick off today, Nick, would love to learn more about you. Let's talk about your background, your experience, and who's on the call today with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So, fantastic to obviously be here and great to meet you. But yeah, background really started off many years ago now, but actually within kind of hospitality trade before then moving into much more kind of sales-led roles. So I then actually went down the route of joining more startup organizations, helping them grow. So first organization I joined helped take that across 13 different countries. We grew that quite significantly. It was across the US, UK, and across Europe and even into kind of UAE. I then finished up where I wanted to kind of achieve and get to with that. And before joining Selligence, when was that, early last year? So pretty much going through a similar trend at the moment. So based out of Cardiff from a HQ point of view, but then we've got New York and Tampa as offices. So it's very much focused in terms of continued growth for us at the moment. But I very much summarize my role here is probably wearing many hats is probably the easiest way to describe that.
I think that's a role that a lot of us on the call today can feel. And I know, one of the things that we're going to talk a lot about today is just really how do we make, the right decisions in the midst of, the word recession is such a strong word, but, that's kind of where we're at today. But before we do that, would love to learn kind of your perception of revenue operations, right? So what is revenue operations to you, right? And how do you work with revenue operations as a sales leader?
I think it's, realistically, it's probably not a role that's really been around, that long historically when you're looking across the rest of the business. But I think it's very quickly becoming the role where people are turning much more of a, kind of open mind to. How I typically describe it, it's more around pulling the strings and finding out, not only from a sales point of view, but also, the other influencing factors across other departments. So how are those coming together? How can you maximize that right across the board? But ultimately, I think it's around getting all those different departments singing off the same hymn sheet. So, where can we get everybody moving in the same direction? Which ultimately, if everybody's pulling in that same direction, it further strengthens the business, helps the revenues and helps the business grow even further than where it's currently at.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as a sales leader, right? What are the key things that you really look for from your revenue operations counterparts, right? What makes your job easier, right? So when RevOps can do X, Y, and Z, or Z in your case for me, what makes that easier? What does that working relationship look like, and how do you measure that success?
Personally, from my point of view, mine is very much driven purely around data. So I'm a big advocate of that and actually trying to unify that across all those different departments. So how can we then start to, align and see the common trends? So in terms of what MQLs are coming in, what are our conversion rates from that aspect? How's that then leading into sales? And then ultimately, where a CS or even growth starting to have that impact in helping bring all that together. So it really is a kind of unification in terms of how are we reporting on all that data? How do we centralize all of it to ultimately give us a true picture in terms of actually what's happening across the business?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, one of the key topics here, right, is like what happens, right? So like we obviously we're in the midst of recession, lots of uncertainty. We went from, a very high the last couple of years to a very, starting to be maybe not say low, but maybe one low, right? And how, as you think about your role in sales, and, I think a lot of people are feeling the do more with less, right? How does this change the way we make decisions? Like, what are the things that we need to start looking for? What are those data points that we need to evaluate? And like, what changes, right? And the big thing I think about, like, obviously we use data to make decisions, and we should be doing that every way. What changes from recession versus non-recession, right? How does that switch what we're doing?
Yeah, I think it's about clawing back and understanding where we at with the market last year, and actually looking at those conversion rates and things like that. So I think if you look, sales is probably the easiest one to quantify on that, but I take it very much from a data point of view. I think a lot of businesses look at it from, okay, this is our conversion rate, this is actually what we're achieving. Whereas, the individuals in the team are that they are actually all individuals, and not one unit all works in the same way. So I think it's about really, getting really, really granular with each individual to understand, okay, where were you last year, in terms of year on year, where were you in this quarter, in the previous year in 2022, and actually what did you achieve. Your demo rate at that point was this. We're now going up to demo to close ratio in terms of X now. So looking at that recession in order to obtain the same, it's then working in multiples of that. The market's obviously getting tighter. I think if somebody hasn't heard a DM say that they've had their budget clawed back over the last couple of months, I think is probably in a very unique position. So it's really about really digging very, very deep into the historical data you've got, but ultimately starting to work and utilize that data in terms of where that current stance is, and understanding then what do the metrics look now based on a year on year basis.
Yeah, and knowing that, your year on year is likely not going to show, the same growth that it historically had. What are some of those decisions then, obviously, like, you have to start to make, right? I think most businesses are generally saying, like, how do we grow, right? But then what does it look like on how do we almost maintain?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's the beauty kind of sales, and it's probably we sell tech into the business, and it's probably this is where the pinch is feeling right across the tech sector as a whole. Everybody's been, over the last probably 2 years, which is why sales have been high. They've been bringing on new tools. They've been looking at ways of streamlining their processes and everything else in between. But actually now I think a lot more people are taking almost a step back to look at that tech stack and saying, okay, how can we almost consolidate some of these tools? How can we create that and make that even tighter? Obviously, clawing back on budget and probably releasing a bit more budget into their day to day. But ultimately, then it's allowing them to capitalize and, I say, create that single line of reporting, if that's probably the right word for it. So we're actually then able to, have less tools. We're able to consolidate perhaps multiple different things into one. But ultimately, what it's then doing is all around centralizing that data into ultimately a CRM, which is, the should be the source of truth, but probably quite often isn't. And I think once you've really got that information really tight, everything's working in unison, that's where you can then start to move things forward. And I think that's typically what is being seen across the market at the moment, is people kind of taking those steps to almost take a step back, start to reevaluate, and then start to put that strategy in place throughout 2023.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a RevOps leader, as we, it's do more with less, right? And like, the things that we constantly look at, especially as we look at buying technology, is what's the platform kind of approach that you're taking. Historically, it's been a lot of point solutions coming together, and you're purchasing these point solutions. You're figuring out a way to make them work together. They all have their individual use cases. How do you look through kind of the oh, sorry that there's an echo from my mic too. Hopefully, let me know if that doesn't resolve. I'll try to stay still too. But how do you think through, what are you trying to solve, right? And when you're doing tool evaluation, being really mindful not only of, the current state and the future state, but what do you need today versus what do you need tomorrow, but also the cost to migrate, right? This is something that you talk a lot about. If I'm buying a solution that feels good for where we are today, right? What if we increase our headcount by 50 people? Will it meet that need? If the answer is no, or if we change revenue or we add more products, right? What's that cost to migrate? And is it worth that upfront investment is another thing spend a lot of time on. And then the additional piece that we continue to evaluate is, licensing. Are our users using the tools the right way? There's obviously a cost for every tool. How do we make sure they're using it right? Where does enablement come into play? How do we make sure, the managers, the data, we're seeing the value of this? If we have a call recording software that we're spending $1,000 a year per user on, and the user records 3 calls a week, is that a good enough ROI? What's that right amount there too? And really drilling into that. Would love to get kind of your perspective as you work from a sales perspective on like what should consumers be looking at to help quantify the value of the technology.
Yeah, exactly. I think there are a couple of points in there really really to address. And, I think the biggest one on that really is, tackle one problem at a time. Don't go at it and think, okay, right, there's a huge issue. We need to rip it all apart and start again. Actually go at it piece by piece. That way you can then start to, figure out and find out the other holes as well. Because once you start to fix one hole, something else will become a bit more clear, and you'll start to shift through that session. And I think that's a major part that often people look at and probably underestimate, because as you said, the cost of migration, the cost of even implementation, especially where you're taking time out of devs and everything else in between, it does get expensive. And it's about monitoring that all the way through.
And the cost to manage, right? I have yet to find a tool that I can just set and truly forget, right? There's anytime you're buying technology, like there has to be a human operator to it. The other thing that I think us consumers, we tend to not think about in this is like, how does the technology support our process, right? So when you are buying technology, when you're looking to solve the problem, like using your process as your driver, right? And then using technology as your enabler of that, right? So your technology should work for your process, for your business, not the other way around. And that's where I start to see companies really get burned when they make these decisions. Is they're, we still talk shiny object syndrome, and I don't think that's going to ever go away. But like, you've got to really make sure the tech's working for you.
100%. And I think a major one, which probably every tech business is probably guilty of a little bit, is customers are coming up to renewal, and ultimately it's like, oh, we've got a new shiny tool, we've got a new shiny feature, we're going to start to celebrate, are you utilizing that, and actually utilize that from a retention point of view. Well, actually, in terms of the products you got and that you have in your tech stack, most of them have account managers attached to them. Most of them have everything else. So quite often something that we really see and we really try to focus on is actually having good engagement with that account manager, rather than them waiting or coming up to renewal and it's like, oh, we've got this new shiny feature, by the way. Is that something you want to, is that going to keep you on the platform? Why aren't we approaching these problems earlier? And actually then, these new features or new releases within those products, perhaps that's solving some of our issues and certainly saving us time before we're even starting to go out and look for other solutions, look at other things that could solve our problems. And I think that's a massive part of a service that is probably quite underserved in terms of what's offered.
Yeah, and from a customer experience, and I think like take this as twofold, right? Like look at your business and say like, is our CS team actually engaging with customers before the point of renewal, right? Yep. And if the answer to that, and it's how many times are they engaging with customers before the point of renewal, right? One time's not good enough, right? Depending your platform, or what are the customer touch points? Let's talk through that, because you might have lower level touch points that come from automation and those components, but as long as they're providing value, I think that that's fine. But there has to be some level of interaction in those pieces. And then from a consumer standpoint, right, if I have a software that I'm spending a good amount of money on every year and I'm not meeting with the CSM quarterly at a minimum, that's a problem, right? And you as consumers are probably not getting what you need out of the tool. Or you might think you are, but you're probably not actually exhausting what you can leverage there. As valuable customers, you should feel empowered to lean on the CS team, lean on the organization to not only understand their roadmap, but also make sure you're utilizing it right. One of the questions that I always ask when I meet with vendors is like, how should we be using this differently? What are you seeing other customers doing? How are they hitting, what are they seeing that we're not doing? And it might not apply to our business case per se, but it is going to help us spin the wheels and say, oh yeah, we haven't thought about doing these things. Like maybe we should implement them. Like don't get like lost in what you're doing, right?
100.
And you use your resources. I mean, you might think you're only paying for the SaaS subscription, but you're paying for the support, you're paying for the service, you're paying for that account management. So leverage it.
100%. It's always the thing that's always forgotten is that additional cost you'll pay and the additional support that is on offer. Utilizing it in every single way that you can. Is it, there, as you said, pick other people's brains. How are their other customers utilizing it? What perhaps other workarounds are people finding within the platform where they having success? And ultimately, more brains the better, right? You're going to get more ideas and flood more out of it. And yeah, I completely agree. It's a hugely underserved part of what you're paying for and what the services that you're getting.
Now, my caveat to this is don't be a jerk and email your CSM every time you have a support ticket, right? Like make sure you follow the process and use it the right way. I mean, I'll apologize to anyone. I have done that in the past, but like use it the right way, build that right relationship. It will make the point of renewal. It will make the point of those conversations so much better in the long run for both parties as you get aligned and do that. So as we think about, the tech, the do more with less, thinking through, not only we're trying to reduce our resources, reduce our spend, but also improve growth, business value, right? When we think specifically about the sales process, what are some of the things that you guys are looking at or seeing in terms of like, how do we better streamline, operationalize? The word of the year has been productivity and like just bolster productivity across the sales organization. So curious on some of the strategies and tactics you guys have applied.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, in terms of, the buying process at the moment, it's certainly extended. It's got more complicated. There's more stakeholders that are being brought into the fold. Ultimately at the moment, that probably the biggest barrier amongst any deal process at the moment is within finance. So the earlier we can start to bring those individuals into that process, so that you've got the CFO's ear, they understand exactly what the cost is, they can start to see the value. Once you've got them bought in terms of, okay, they understand the cost, it's then around, who else can you bring into that organization? So, other CROs, are you bringing in even likes of AEs and SDRs if you're selling into that sector? Like, how can we start to utilize those to then influence, the CFO? Because ultimately that's where that's going, but it's all going to lead back to that final marker. But it's around then building those relationships and leverage, and essentially building almost like an emotional relationship with the CFO. So that once they then start having that leverage and everything else bought into it, it's then, it's an easy transition through, rather than it being a blocker or a last minute battle, as I'm sure many people are experiencing in end of quarter.
Yeah, and as you're working with, the CFO, and I think that's great advice, from what you're seeing like RevOps, right? What are the key kind of things that you're looking at in those proposals, right? How do you help build that business case with the operations specialists for it to make sense from a financial perspective? What are some of, the levers or the dials you guys are really trying to quantify?
So we found a moving in terms of, and again, through tracking lots of different data in terms of, outbound activity, in terms of response rates, and that's right across, email campaigns, that's across the likes of LinkedIn, that's from outbound cold calling and so forth. And what we've really done is dig very, very deeply into the data in terms of, the best response times in terms of across all those different channels. And we're starting to really break up the consultants like day to day. So all of the AEs now are working very, very structured, which is very different in the US to how we're operating in the UK. But it's starting to fit in terms of where the best responses are within that. So we're getting like kind of that granular in terms of how they're working and where, because before we were very, very heavy on a cold outbound perspective in terms of cold calling. That was where the majority of our success came from. But over probably the past 5 to 6 months, that's shifted dramatically. So through tracking that, we were able to pick out and pinpoint those movements very, very quickly. So that's where we've been able to shift and shape that, the day to day.
No, that's great. And I think, that's, as budgets get cut, and I laugh because I've been spending a lot of time just today on like procurement pieces, is, really how you measure that value, how you manage that value, and how, I spend a lot of time, my best piece of advice for anyone who starts a company, or starts working at a company who doesn't have their tech stack documented, go to finance and say, tell me how much we pay per month. Like, what are we getting invoiced, right? Like, show me the contracts, and let's make sure we get it documented. Because one of the things that I think we don't do a good job at is really managing the ongoing spend across our stack, especially license-based pieces, right? If you're not negotiating growth within your contract, if you're not, really looking at usage and those components, like, you're likely paying for things you don't need. And so really staying on top of that. The other piece is, like, if you don't have your contract centralized and really, as simple as a Google Sheet, you're likely going to hit auto renewals and not even realize you renewed on something that no one is using because Bob Smith put it on a credit card 3 years ago and it's just continued to renew, and that's where it's at. So again, I think tech stack management, especially at this point, is such a strong point of what we need to do better as ops professionals. And then on the secondary piece, and what Nic has really talked to, is like, how do we use the data, right? Not only from the stack, but the data that we're producing from our process, to pull those right levers, to make sure we're setting, one of the things that I think you talked really well about is like setting the right expectations for growth, right? Especially with where we're at. And, what are some of like your strategies in having those, what I'd consider almost crucial conversations, or, they're not the fun conversations, right?
Right.
Not only like with leadership, right, on what's feasible, but then also downstream to the seller organization.
I think you hit the nail on the head. They're not the fun conversations to have, and they're probably certainly not in terms of where expectations were from 6, 7 months ago, realistically. But within that space, it's around having those, but becoming much more unified from a senior management point of view. And actually, what you're then starting to do when that starts to be channeled, downstream to people at desk, people at the day to day, is taking them on that journey. Many people probably at that level, they haven't been through recession, they haven't been through tough periods. So what does it mean now? But actually, what's the light at the end of the tunnel? And actually, once you've aligned everything at the top in terms of what that looks like from a forecasting perspective, I think the major topic at the moment is people understanding that Q2 is probably going to lift up slightly, but everybody really aiming towards probably the end of Q3, Q4 for a heavy end for the year. So how do you then take those people at desk on that journey to ultimately get their buy-in, ultimately minimize your staff turnover as well, but just retain that experience that you have got within your team, so that when the market does really turn and builds, that actually you're going to be off to a running start.
And when you think about, one of the common themes here too is, right, is maintenance and expansion and what you already have, right? We all, there's a factor, and we all should probably know it, but it's cheaper to retain than it is to acquire. So what are some of the pieces that you think about as you look at, changing potentially from an acquisition into more of a retention and expansion play, and some of the data points that you're looking at there?
So as much, in terms of, like, I suppose from any department really, but again, sales is pretty quantifiable. But that kind of speed to first deal, like, how can we get people up and running? What are we expecting? What do those expectations look like? And much like ourselves, we're still growing within that space, we're still adding individuals in, but it's then actually, how do we change those expectations to fit with the current market? You don't want somebody coming in expecting exactly the same lift off as somebody compared to a year ago. So what can we do to then understand how current AEs are, and then reverse engineering that in order to fit the new model, so that expectations can still be aligned, people can still feel motivated, and actually that they're achieving. But ultimately, where you're adding people in around this period now, they're starting to gain that experience, let's be honest, within a much harder market, much harder conversations that they're having. So again, as you start to transition out of that things really will pick up and move forward pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I think, as at the end of the day, right, the customer experience and like that is so critical for businesses to focus on. Obviously acquisition becomes important, but keeping what you have and making sure you have that right pivot, that right attention, and getting that focus where it needs to be. We had a question from the audience regarding the best strategy to present when moving off of a tool in your tech stack, especially when one other team is attached to it but it's not crucial. Would love to get kind of your perspective on that, and then I'm happy to share mine too.
We've probably just been going through exactly the same thing, if I'm honest. Ultimately, the decision lies in terms of what's best for the business. It's again, it is difficult because not every single person within a business is going to work in the same way. So you're always going to have one person that's stickier to it than others. But ultimately, what's going to bring the best efficiency for the business as a whole, and ultimately, as you mentioned, what's going to bring you the best ROI on that? Is it actually investing within another tool that perhaps even creates surplus budget, which actually means you can reinvest that into something else, perhaps reinvest it even into your marketing spend and so forth like that. But ultimately, it's got to be something that everybody's aligned on. But again, it's probably taking, if there is that individual that's very reliant on that one tool, it's about bringing them on that journey, getting them to understand, and ultimately the new tool or replacement, how's that going to enhance perhaps their day to day as well, beyond what they're currently experiencing or how they're stuck in their ways.
Yeah, as much as possible, make them think it was their idea.
Yeah.
That's maybe bad advice, but generally works out pretty well. The other thing I think is like data becomes key in that, right? So when you look at this, is like as much as possible, try to make it black and white. Here's what we spend, here's what we get from this. Here's either where the duplication is, where that is. Spend the time to really evaluate, analyze, and drive and like make it very clear, especially if it is an overhead cost, the utilization's not there, it's not driving the value that's necessary. I think is really what drives. The best way to say it is remove emotion from the decisions. Like as much as like technology purchases shouldn't be emotional, they any type of purchase generally starts to become emotional to some level, especially if it's where you spend your day to day, you're using it for key things like, but really try to make it a clear cut piece. The other side of this is like bring voices to the table, make sure people feel heard. I think that tends to also be, it might be less sensitivity to actually removing the tool and more sensitivity to not feeling like they were a part of the process. And so I think that also becomes just really something to be mindful of when making these decisions. One of the best pieces of advice regarding tech that I have ever gotten is like, don't buy a tool because of a person, right? I think that's such a huge thing. I've worked with several companies over my time and they're, oh, we need Marketo because this is what I used at my last company or what I'm familiar with, right? Like people don't stay forever. And the second you make those decisions based on people and the person leaves, you're in, you're stuck, right? Make the decision based on what the business needs versus like the person who operates. Obviously, there's value in having somebody who has the experience, right? But ideally, when you're hiring and you're bringing people in, you should be bringing people in who can learn the tools, learn the stack. I joke and talk a lot with my team and people I've hired is like, you really don't want a tool in your title, right? You don't want to be Mollie the Salesforce admin, right? You want to be able to grow your career in the right way and be agnostic and know how to solve a problem with technology, but not be constructed by the technology as well. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that. I just talked for a long time there.
No, I thought the really interesting point within that, and I think it really is something that not enough people do, is just be open and transparent in terms of what stuff costs, because it's very much hidden always behind the scenes with businesses, and I think a lot of people really don't understand. So actually, when you start to have these conversations as perhaps that one individual that wants that tool, and suddenly you start telling them that it's costing you 30, 40, $50,000, they'll suddenly start to realize why the decisions are being made, and why that transition is going to happen. As you said, the more black and white that is, and ultimately, if they can, even once you've implemented the new tool, they can start to see the results themselves, and you can start to compare that in terms of their performance previously, then suddenly that starts to really sink true, and start to understand, and probably more so trust you even further in terms of the decisions and why you're making them.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I did earlier this year, and I hadn't done at other companies before, but what I did was I actually did a breakout by role of how much the company, it's not how much the company pays, right? But like you think about, how much does the company provide in health insurance? How much does the company, those types of pizzas? But how much does an actual like tech stack cost per SDR, per AE, per AM? And really started to lay that out. So we understood, what that investment was, what the categorizations of investment were, and what the expectations were for usage, to really ensure that we were putting the right efforts into the right platforms, into the right, essentially processes to get that. But when you start putting that on paper, it's, you could be spending an extra $10,000 to $15,000 per SDR on technology to help equip them to do their job, right? Like, and I think that puts things into a really strong perspective as you look at, not only stack inflation, but stack value. So if you haven't done that, for the people on the call, it's kind of an interesting exercise.
It's probably even more so to keep track of, because as you said, people quite often, you've got 60-day renewal terms and you've got everything else, but what you'll also have in that each and every year, those prices are going up. They're going up 5%, 10% each year. So these are really getting into that and understanding how that's transitioning year on year as well is going to be absolutely key to maintain that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Paul asked a good two-sided question. So appreciate that, Paul. So Nic, we'll go with you first. From a sales leader perspective, what expectations do you have, and how do you work with RevOps to plan strategy for future quarters and years?
Good question. So
especially in the context of a potential market downturns, let's add the like kicker in there.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, because ultimately, it depends obviously when your budgets were set and expectations. But, a lot of people, I think if we're being frank, didn't probably expect things to be where they were probably as quickly as they have been over the last few months. So I think this is where working very, very closely with people, having good stakeholder management internally is absolutely vital, because bringing them into the data that's being, tracked across different departments is key, because that's going to help you tell that story moving forward. So, is actually, the performance increasing in terms of the uplift in terms of volumes that people are doing from an output perspective? Is that performance increasing, but the deals are taking longer? So you can then start to bring them on that journey in terms of that transition. And as I mentioned earlier, I think, many people at the moment have probably had a much quieter Q1. We're expecting a bit more of a lift up in Q2, but probably still below expectations where they were probably 4 or 5 months ago. But then planning for that strong Q3. So how are you also then backing that up with your hiring strategy? Are you starting to build people into that picture now? So again, as that market starts to shift, you've got experienced individuals within there that can start to really lift and ultimately claw back perhaps some of the losses that have been made in H1.
Yeah, absolutely. And then on the flip side of that, from my perspective as a revenue ops leader, what are the expectations I have of sales leaders during this process? And right, I think, some of the soft pieces that I care about, right, is like the alignment. I think the alignment is so critical, not only with the sales leaders, but also the marketing leaders, is to come together and make sure, we have those KPIs we're looking at. We understand why we're looking at what we're looking at and what we're trying to turn. When you talked a lot about like average deal cycle, right? What are our expectations of how much longer this is going to take, right? We expect that our velocity is going to ultimately increase. We're not going to close this fast. How do we then work together and build the right strategy with marketing and make sure we have those additional touch points at the right time to help bring this together, and setting those expectations around the strategy, around the goals, and make sure we're talking the same language. Again, I think sounds so simple, right? But alignment is really hard. And alignment when there's not authority is even harder. And in most organizations, there's not authority across this, right? So when you think about this, it's like you've got your marketing, you got your CS, you got your sales, you got your RevOps. Like, well, they might all report to the CRO potentially. There's not still that authority, right? And so you have to really make an effort on that alignment And it has to be a cognizant effort, and it has to be something that you can then continue to quantify back to and understand, what are our expectations, what are our goals. And the concerns that I start to see is people start speaking a different language, right? They're looking at these different measures that then don't actually come together. And it's okay to have your secondary metrics, but like you've got to have this group on your top level of like, this is what we need to be doing, and this is what we expect results to be. Here's what we're holding ourselves accountable for. And we're going to meet every week, every other week, and track the progress to it.
I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head. That alignment is so hard. Everybody's got different ideas. Everybody's shifting day to day. They're seeing different things, hearing different things throughout each week. So something I know, we very conscious of and doing here is actually bringing together those strategy meetings much more closer together. So actually, rather than every quarter to kind of review and every 6 months in terms of planning, we've brought those almost monthly at the moment, just to ensure that everybody is still singing on that same hymn sheet. Are we still keeping close? And that's actually starting to really create a much more tight-knit, community where we're having frequent conversations, and ultimately we can be reactive very quickly on those as well.
Right, because you have to anticipate, right? Even within the it's at any point, but even more so with, uncertainty in the market, like there will be pivots, right? Things will change. You will be testing, you will be, seeing what works and what helps to move the needle, and like staying aligned in that is so crucial. Especially as you think about, the people who actually have to deliver on those initiatives. If you're like, oh yeah, we're going to test this pricing, best thing. Sorry, I'm going to rag on salespeople. Apologies, Nic. Comes together and is like, hey, we're going to completely revamp these spiffs for this quarter. And they tell you like 2 days before it has to happen, right? It's like, oh, but we can't actually measure or track that because we're not set up to do that today. So that's where that communication, that alignment, that foresight, well, it might not be, you might not have as much of a runway because it might be, the quick idea that we need to test and we need to swag through it. But still, again, keeping that dialogue in place. And like, again, I laugh because I'm like, I feel like a parent. I'm like, use your resources. But like as coworkers, we should be using each other as resources and starting to, group think on ideas and get that different perspective as well. Like I much prefer to, especially when planning and those pieces, is like asking my team, like, what do you see? Right? What do you think we should be doing that we're not doing? Like, if you're not asking those downstream questions to your team, like even especially your salespeople, right? Like, what are we missing? Yeah.
Who are speaking to your customers? Who's understanding the market more and more every minute of every single day? Utilize them and feed it back into the system, into the cycle.
Yeah, and especially like at the times where it is a lot harder generally, right? Been a lot harder. There's a lot of uncertainty. Like, what could I do to make your life easier? Right? Those are questions that I think about from, an ops perspective, even if it's as simple as, geez, Mollie, like we ask way too many questions when we try to close an opportunity in Salesforce, right? Like, this isn't super valuable. Like, how do we make this help improve my efficiency, improve my productivity? Like, those are little things, but like it's still valuable feedback, right? And you should try to make sure your teams feel heard, you're taking things into consideration. Doesn't mean you're going to do everything, but at least start to understand like what are some of like the small things that can contribute that will have at least a meaningful impact. Might not totally go back to a monetary impact, but there could still be a soft satisfaction impact too, which I think is still important.
100%. And even as you said, those little things that perhaps you can add in that don't take any time really for somebody sat at desk. Actually start to think which are going to be the most impactful, where you can start to get really, really targeted, 60, 90, 120 days later, where actually then that's going to start to bring in more of those MQLs back through perhaps some just one piece of additional data that you've enforced on the team.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, reminder to audience, like, please shoot in questions here as well. I mean, obviously, I think anyone who's joined these know that I'm perfectly fine to keep talking, but want to make sure you guys are heard. As you talk about what we expect to see around the Q3 timeframe. Like, how do you help to kind of prepare your team for that, right? What are some of the things that you're not only doing today to help prepare them, but what are the changes that you feel like you've made internally that you'll keep right, recently too, that have been like actual positive changes that you would apply without the downturn you wish you did sooner?
I'm trying to think. So certainly, like in terms of the daily structure and actually breaking that up, that's something that's going to be way more reactive in terms of how the market goes, and whether that changes, whether there's shifts within that pattern. So that's going to be that side of it. In terms of actually probably something we will keep, is actually to keep that team really tight knit and bring them much closer together. We've done a lot more kind of socializing together. I'm not talking general things, let's all go out for a drink and do something on Friday. A lot more stuff within the week.
Still important things to do though.
Yeah, 100. Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. I do love a beer, but from that point of view, even stuff within the week. So whether that's going out for a walk together, at lunch, whatever that may be, it's just around how tight can we keep everybody together, and again throughout all the different departments. So we're trying to do a lot more of that. So actually, there becomes much more of a unison that actually through the tougher times, those people feeling like they're much closer together. But as we start to transition out, I firmly believe, I think, they'll be working as a much tighter knit group as a result of that, and ultimately just making that much stronger, as in when that market does turn.
No, that's great. And how do you feel, with the team? I'm not sure if you guys are fully remote, or obviously you're not fully remote because you're sitting in an office. But how have you how have you worked with some of like your remote employees and helped kind of bring some of that camaraderie virtually?
It's there are obviously challenging times. Probably the biggest challenge for us, is across the ponds. We've got people in the US, we've got people in the UK. That's always the biggest challenge. So what we're starting to do there is a lot more kind of like group kickoffs, but a lot more of like sharing ideas. So we're having numerous sessions right throughout the week, through SDRs departments, through AEs, and everybody in between, to start to understand what are they hearing from cross borders. Are there different
Yeah.
shifts, and certainly a pattern quite often, in terms of that fight, the kind of economy and things like that. In terms of a recession, it's often something you will start to see shift, and it will affect one area first before the rest. So is there information actually it was starting to share there that then they can start to see that trend shifting across? There have been elements of that, but hopefully, I say that's something we're going to continue. But hopefully we'll start to see some more results from that as well. So it's just about bringing people a lot more closer together, more open conversations, and seeing what they can do. I don't know what you've done from your side.
Yeah, no, I think that that's great. And Deel is, if you're familiar, we're 100% remote. Everyone is remote and everyone is everywhere. I joke. My joke is, it's not a joke because it's not a really good joke, but I have team members on every continent other than Antarctica right now. So I mean, one day maybe Antarctica, but you've got to make again the cognizant effort to foster those relationships and gather that feedback. And it is hard, right? Because human instinct is trust and relational building versus just spilling your guts to somebody you don't know, who's your coworker, right? But like opening up, and as leaders, we need to create those safe spaces for that dialogue and build that foundation for that communication and capturing that information. And as leaders, the best thing we can do is make sure we apply what we learn, right? And whether it's application or acknowledgement, both are equally as important, right? And no one wants to be asked to do something that doesn't get acknowledged, right? Because then you're just wasting effort. So I think that's one of the things that we need to do a good job of, and like doing it in a way that not always is a group too. And that's, I think, something that we've not created always those great spaces during this virtual or this global workforce where you're having more of those meaningful one-on-ones and you feel like you have the time and attention before you've got to jump to that next Zoom, which you get like. And I think the thing that you talked about, and this is one of the things I miss so much about working in an office, is going on a walk, right? That was one of my favorite things to go and do with team members, because it was like, let's humanize, let's get out of this conference room and sit and have the conversation. We got a couple other questions here too from Charlie. How are you thinking about aligning marketing and CS to existing customers to retain them and increase usage and ultimately upsell them?
Good one. A lot of this, in terms of what we're doing with this, is starting to share as well as like all the data behind the usage behind the product and everything else from that perspective. This probably goes back into what you were saying earlier, Mollie, is, what are our other customers doing? Where are they starting to see success? How are they doing that? And it's about relaying that information straight across. But more importantly as well, what we've really started to do is to starting to get our CS and our marketing to actually sit in on sales calls as well, so they can start to understand, how is that market shifting? What are the salespeople hearing within the market? How are they reacting to that? And ultimately, once we start to get those aligned, what we have seen is, marketing being able to become much more apparent in terms of the current market rather than being pretty standardized with things. But more importantly, CS is constantly just, really getting educated in terms of what, sales are hearing across like big objections and so forth. So it's really helping them prepare for around that renewal phase. So that's something where we have seen some real success very quickly, if I'm honest as well.
Yeah, and I think the other piece of this, right, is like bringing the sales team into the CS fold as well, and understanding, hey, these are the clients we were able to get moving very successfully, right? Like these were the pain points that they had, and here are the things that we applied that if we started having these conversations, in the sales cycle, might have helped it move quicker or showed that value add. Or to your second point, Charlie, is like, is it better to double down on your ICP or expand it? And I think that goes down to like, if you expand your ICP, do you provide the same amount of value, right? Like at the end of the day, you can't be something to everyone versus being, the right thing to someone. And so it comes down to, if you expand and, and it might be a good time to test, right? Like, do we get penetration if we switch and add additional industries, right? And what does that look like, and how much adjustment has to happen to our product, right? Everything is a trade-off. If I decide that I'm going to go, I currently sell to teachers and tomorrow I'm going to sell to police officers. Sorry, really bad example, but what has to change in my product, right? What adjustments make there? And am I going to go off of my like bread and butter to support that? And like, have I proven that? So I do think there's a level of, testing that has to happen. And Nic, would love your perspective and understanding, like, how is this a tactic you guys have tried too, and what you look at from an ICP standpoint?
100%. It is something we've done previously, and we've done it as well pretty recently as well. But I would probably firmly advise the testing part that you mentioned. There's definitely, there's an element where you've got to break out of your comfort zone. It depends how big, your tangible market is really, in terms of, is there room to double down on your ICP? What's competition like? How have you been performing against competition? Start to take all of that into consideration. But ultimately, there may be areas out there that you've been thinking about, we haven't really tested, where actually it might have a really good fit, provide some really good value for those customers. But I would certainly A/B test that within small buckets, because you can get lost. You can get lost down a rabbit hole, and ultimately, your resource, your time spent, and cost of that can be, seriously affected with it as well.
Yeah, just the investment piece. And I love, we always, this sounds like a bad example, and I might take us back 5 years on this, but we think marketing, sales, CS, right? How do you move marketing down below and move marketing just so it's not sitting on this top of funnel kind of component of this, and getting, that tied in to the expansion, to, again, to Ben's point, what's happening on the sales calls? What are we hearing? How can we apply that messaging? How can we, make sure we're thinking of the right use cases that we're using to capture too? And, you, again, use your resources, group think, work as a team, not in silos, all things we are so aware of and we talk about, but like stepping back and saying, are we actually practicing what we're preaching, outside of just the PowerPoint that we put together for our QBR at our exec level, right?
Exactly that. I think I was going to say something and I've completely forgotten. So yeah, carry on.
Yeah. And Charlie, back to tech stack, what's another mission critical tool other than, the CRM from your perspective, right? What could you not do your job without? Or what could your team not do their job without?
I could be quite biased here because our team do use our tool, but one that I would certainly double down on, if you're looking at it, the market is tight. The market is, it's getting harder and harder to find the right people to reach out to at the right time. So have a look and, look at tools that can aid you with that, with a, additional lead generation process. I'm not saying you put your whole team into it and it's like, right, that's all you're using, go, that's it. You need a blend of the two. But anything that can assist you in that, certainly within this market, that's really going to help you. So that's something I'd look at.
Yeah, definitely. I think, go ahead, finish your thought.
No, the other point that we've really looked at doing is, investing in tools that again align across all those different departments. So how can we join up, marketing with inbounds and MQLs, with sales, with CS, and actually even within our product as well. So again, it's just about aligning with that, but those are definitely what I'd look at.
Yeah, and I think I like the point that you made that I think really resonates, is like the diversification, right, of the process. I think it's hard because we want to keep people in a standard workflow, right, and like try to be very consistent and precise, but we also don't want to be myopic to what we're missing in that. So understanding like how to augment, how to be more creative, like how to not just say this is how I source, but I might be missing the rest of the world over here. And then the other piece of this is like, if you haven't done a time study with your, SDR team, with your prospecting team, like sit and do a time study, understand how much time does it take for them to find a qualified lead, then reverse engineer, how much does that actually cost? How much time does it take when, and like understand where they're spending their time. And you should do it not just with your SDRs, you should do it with honestly, like every role that you have, to start finding those weak points in the process. And that's where, when we think about the people, process, data, technology, you start to figure out, if I could reduce prospecting for an SDR by 25%, right? Let's say they spend 2 hours a day doing prospecting. If I could cut that down to 30 minutes, what do they use that additional hour and a half on, right? Generally, they use it on better messaging, right? Better delivery, better components that should improve conversion rate. So doing, I think any tool, and like before you look at the tool, right, understand the business problem that you're trying to solve as it relates to the process, but start to then, again, going back an hour now, back to the ROI conversation, right? Like that's how you start to build the ROI and build the case, right? And, a lot of companies are less, they're not hiring as much, right? Like, what does this help to supplement? Likely less of the cost of an SDR potentially from a headcount perspective, but can help to supplement, what the activity is or the time commitment of 5 SDRs. So make sure you're doing, I'm going to say do the math, but make sure you're doing the math and understanding what you can do there. And then the other tool that I think you talked about this well too, is like, it comes back to the data, right? Like, and I don't know that that's necessarily always has to be this tool. I'm not saying you need to go out and like buy, this fancy BI tool, right? But have a way to speak the same language and have the consistency across your KPIs, across your metrics. And it doesn't have to be a tool. Tools can help in that. But you've got to have the strategy, you've got to have the mindset, and you've got to have the alignment to really bring that together, but have a framework for how you're going to look at the business and measure your business. I know we've got about 5 minutes left. What else do you want to talk about, Nic? I think I'll leave you 5 minutes. That's very gracious of me.
That's okay.
As you're sitting in the dark, and we're.
I think I know we've touched on a hell of a lot there, really. But if there's anything I think that anybody can take to this, it is the alignment piece. If you've constantly got the battles with other stakeholders, perhaps got other ideas and things like this, it just makes your life so miserable. It's so hard, and ultimately nobody's ever going to get anywhere. You've got to pull in the right direction, certainly within hard periods and tougher times. So the closer you can start to bring people to that, bring people in your ideas, and ultimately, if you've got ideas, share them as well. I think that's something that's often forgotten. Start to get feedback on the other key stakeholders within the organization. How is it going to affect other departments and that new idea that you have? But start to share it, start to feel it out before you think about implementing it. You think about talking about it to the wider business, to the wider staff. start to really understand the pain points of that from each department, and actually if they got different ideas that can counteract, or what can they change to help perhaps fit in that good idea if it is one. But the tighter you can get as an organization, as a business, then ultimately I think you're going to come out on top in terms of the tougher periods, and build up for that stronger finish to the year. That would probably be my biggest point.
No, I love that. And I think, to just add the other pieces like transparency, right? Transparency during uncertainty, I think goes such a long way, right? Anytime there's uncertainty, there's always some level of panic, of, a concern generally, but the more you can be transparent, be honest, be fair, right? To your team, to your employees, like, the better, right? And generally it goes, if you're like, oh yeah, we're increasing your quota, right? Why? How? What led you to this decision, and be able to explain that is a lot better than just because.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. It's not just the key stakeholders that you're trying to do this to. Business isn't always sunshine and rainbows. There are tougher periods, and the transparency you can have with your team around that, the more they're going to trust you. That's the bottom line. And again, with that trust, you've got more chance than anybody else in order to retain that team, again, further upskill them, make that business unit even stronger, so that again, as you continue to move forward, and hopefully times will get easier, then you've probably got a very, very good foundation in terms of a team that is going to stick with you for some time.
Yeah, absolutely. So perfect. Well, thank you so much, Nic. Anyone else in the audience have any questions? I won't hold people if we don't have other topics, but really appreciate the time today. And I think great insights. This is, I think we'd all appreciate having the conversation of what do you do when you're in hyper growth and everything is going awesome. But I think having this conversation is super important and super good to be aware of, and working forward.
Likewise. No, great to have a conversation. I say, if anybody's got any questions or want to pick my brain, then please reach out.
Awesome. Well, thank you.